Assalamualaikum and selamat sejahtera to Dr. Mara and our fellow classmates. So today, my group, Dylan, Gary, Kasrina and I, Nur Anis, will be presenting on the topic of stakeholder theory and legitimacy theory. Firstly, we're going to look at the stakeholder theory. So our discussion will cover on the introduction of stakeholder theory, classifications of stakeholders, stakeholder theory model, stakeholder theory principles, and last but not least, the benefits and drawbacks of the stakeholder theory. In 1984, R. Edward Freeman states that stakeholder theory is a theory of organizational management and business ethics that addresses morals and values in managing an organization. It suggests that anyone that is affected by the organization or its workings in any way is considered a stakeholder, including the employees, customers, suppliers, local communities, and more. So stakeholder theory holds that organizations and corporations should strive to do right by all these stakeholders, and that in doing so, the organization will achieve true lasting success. Or in other words, this stakeholder theory seeks to provide a balance between the interests of its diverse stakeholders in order to ensure each one receives some degree of satisfaction. There are two types of stakeholders, which are internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders are those who have an operational role in the company, for example, the corporate directors, sub-board management, and employees. Internal stakeholders' main interests in the company are usually the pay, performer-related bonuses, share options, career progressions, reputations, and working conditions. While external stakeholders are those who are not members of a company but can affect and be affected by its operation, such as the shareholders, auditors, customers, suppliers, government body, or the community itself. So these are also the example of internal and external stakeholders for a company. So next is the stakeholder theory model. There are three approaches of stakeholder theory, which are descriptive approach, normative approach, and instrumental approach. So what is descriptive approach? This approach looks at stakeholders as an ends, or in other words, as an individual with legitimate rights towards the firm. It provides a language and concepts to describe corporations, the way they work, and their impacts on the wider environment. Next is the instrumental approach. This approach looks at stakeholders as means to improve corporate performance. It means to increase efficiency, better business performance, and ultimately higher profits. It allows for the testing of the connections between managing stakeholders and reaching business targets. And the third one, normative approach, where it analyzes the nature and scope of the various relationships with the stakeholders. Each stakeholders group has intrinsic value, and that no group's interests are more or less important than any other. So next is the stakeholder theory principle. Freeman has also outlined 6 principles that should govern the relationship between the stakeholders and the corporations. So those principles are, the first one is the principle of entry and exit. The second one is the principle of externalities. The third one is the principle of agency. The fourth is the principle of governance. The fifth is the principle of contract costs. And lastly is the principle of limited immortality. Okay, so let's go one by one. The first one is the principle of entry and exit. According to this principle, there must be clear rules that delineate. For example, the rules when it comes to hiring employees and terminating their employment should be clear-cut and transparent. In other words, an entity should have clear rules for hiring, firing, and work profile of the employees with no ambiguity. The second one is the principle of externalities. This is concerned with how a group that does not benefit from the actions of the corporations has to suffer certain difficulties because of the actions of the corporations. The principle of externalities suggests that anyone who has to bear the cost of other stakeholders has the right to become a stakeholder as well based on stakeholder theory. So basically this principle explains that the decision taken by an entity may affect people who have no relations with the entity. So the theory suggests that people who may be affected by the findings of a business are also to be treated at par with the other stakeholders. So the third one, the principle of agency. So this principle states that the manager of a firm is an agent of the firm and therefore has responsibilities to the stakeholder as well as the shareholders. So this principle of agency explains the shareholders appoint the company's management to run the entity's business. So management is not the owner of the entity but an agent acting on behalf of the company.
The next stakeholders theory principles are the principle of governance. This principle is concerned with how the rules governing the relationship between the stakeholders in the firm can be amended. In short, any changes affecting the relationship between stakeholders and the company needs to be approved by them unanimously. Next is the principle of contract costs. Each party to a contract should either bear equal amounts when it comes to cost, or the cost they bear should be proportional to the advantage they have in the firm. Not all of these costs are financial in nature, so they may be difficult to be quantified. So, the stakeholder should bear any costs on an equal basis. For example, one should not pay more than another. Furthermore, the cost sharing should be similar or proportionate to the advantage gained. Last but not the least is the principle of limited immortality. This principle deals with longevity of a firm. To ensure the success of the organization and its owners alike, it is necessary for the organization to exist for a prolonged period of time. If the firm only exists for a very limited period of time, it would be advantageous for some of the stakeholders and disadvantageous to others. This violates the concept of a stakeholder theory, and thus the firm must remain in existence for a length of time and should be managed in a way that ensures its survival. Limited immortality refers to the fact that the firm can be long-lasting, but it is impossible for it to actually be immortal. In short, the firm should operate with long-term objective at focus and not for the motivation of short-term peaks. Longevity ensures confidence in the stakeholders of entity. The stakeholder is concerned with the long-term goals of the entity. Next, what are the benefits of stakeholder theory? In practice, stakeholder theory can promote a positive feedback loop that ultimately leads to greater returns for stakeholders and shareholders. For example, when employees are viewed and treated as valued stakeholders, they are motivated to do better and higher quality work. This can lead to a boost in production volume and quality, which then leads to happier and more satisfied customers. Satisfied customers then tend to help boost sales and business growth, which will make the shareholders themselves happy. In a project management context, treating all project stakeholders, from team members to project sponsors to executives, as valued participants can positively affect the final project outcome. Next are the drawbacks of stakeholder theory. There are a couple of drawbacks of stakeholder theory, which number one is the interests of various stakeholders cannot be balanced against each other. The second one is stakeholders represent such a large and diverse groups. And the last but not the least is some stakeholders might find that they are not impacting decisions much as another group.
Alright, hello, hi. So for my part, I will be explaining on the legitimacy theory. So based on Sackman, they considered that the legitimacy itself is a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate within some socially constructed system of norms, value, beliefs, and definitions. So let's move on to the next page. Okay, now let's look at the origins of legitimacy theory. So, legitimacy theory is actually an accounting theory, but then it originates from the institutional theory. But the concept of legitimacy theory is a key component of institutional theory. Okay, so in coming up with the legitimacy theory, which is the first researchers who came up with this theory, they only borrow a certain aspect of the institutional theory because the institutional theory is very broad. And in borrowing those aspects of institutional theory, they also simplified again those aspects in order to come up with a simple theory. So as a result of that, legitimacy theory is actually a simple theory to understand and also to employ and test in studies, as it makes some simplifying assumptions. However, if you can see here, a shortcoming of being simple is that although the legitimacy theory is able to explain to a certain extent, but then manages motivation for providing voluntary CSR disclosure, they are not able to give a deep and comprehensive understanding of the voluntary disclosure phenomenon. So it's like we are able to understand certain things, but then we are unable to understand the complete picture, the whole story of it, because of the result of the theory being so simple. Okay. However, if we look at the bright side, it actually does help us to understand at least those few things rather than not being able to understand anything at all. Okay, next, let us talk about the concept of legitimacy. So, what is legitimacy? Okay, an organization is considered to be legitimate if society perceives that its operations conform with the expectation and values of the society. Meaning that, in this case, if the society thinks that the organization operations is according to their expectation and values, then they will consider that organization as being legitimate. And the opposite is also true, which is if the society thinks that an organization operations that do not conform to their expectation and values, then they will consider the organization to be illegitimate. Okay, the opposite of legitimate lah, basically. Alright, so why is it important for organization to be considered as legitimate? Okay, well, under legitimacy theory, organizations are considered not to have any inherent right to resources such as raw material, labor, and capital. Okay, so who has the right to these resources? Obviously, the society. So, in order for the organizations to have the resources from the operation which belongs to the society, they have to obtain first the permission from society to use these resources. And society, they will only give a permissions to organization if they consider those organization as legitimate. So that is why it is very important for the organizations to be considered as legitimate by the society. And if you look at it that way, then we can look at the legitimacy as being a resources in self-organization, because without it or without legitimacy, organization won't be able to access all the resources such as raw materials, labor, and capital that they need for the operations. Alright, next, let us look at the concept of social contract. So this is another important concept in the legitimacy theory. So what is the social contract? Okay, the social contract is a hypothetical contract that is agreed upon by organization and society. So it means that it is not a real contract, and there is no black and white in this contract. Okay, but we can look at the social contract as an understanding between organization and also society in terms of what they have to do for each other and in terms of their commitments toward each other. So we can say that in this social contract, it implies that both organizations and also the society itself have a certain obligation that they have to fulfill under this social contract. And what are these obligations is that for organization, they have to make sure that the operations must conform expectations and values of the society, and in exchange for that society, they will permit them, the organization, to use the resources that they need that the organization need for their operations. So the terms in these social contracts are both explicit and also implicit. For the explicit terms are the laws and regulations in the country that organizations have to adhere to, and for the implicit terms are the expectations and value of society. So organizations have to adhere to these terms in order to be granted permission to use the resources by the society. Alright, next is legitimacy is in the eye of the beholder. So what is meant by that legitimacy is that it is based on how society perceive an organizations, but not on the actual performance of the organizations, meaning that organization, they can manipulate society into perceiving it as being legitimate, okay, regardless of its actual performance. Like even though like they say that an organization doesn't actually conform its operations, doesn't actually conforms to the expectations and the values of society, but they still can manipulate society into thinking that it is legitimate. So legitimacy is based on how society perceive an organizations, not on the actual performance of the organizations. Okay, so how can an organization manipulate society into thinking that it is legitimate? All right, so they can do this. They employ legitimizing strategies, which are strategies that can make an organization appear to be legitimate. So there are a lot of legitimizing strategies, and one of such strategies is by providing a social and environmental disclosure in the financial statements. That is one of their strategies. Okay. So the provisions of social and environmental disclosure is the subject of study. It is the focus of legitimacy theory. It wants to study why organizations do this. Okay?
Now, let's talk about the differences between stakeholder theory and legitimacy theory. Under stakeholder theory, any identifiable group or individual who can affect or is influenced by the achievement of an organization goals. This is under Freeman and Reed 1983. Examples include shareholders, creditors, the government, employees, their families, local communities, and future generations. Whereas under legitimacy theory, organizations attempt to operate within the borders and standards of their local communities so that their operations are seen as legitimate. Organizations must be flexible to changing boundaries and conventions, which is based on the concept of a social contract. Under stakeholder theory, the ethical (moral) and the positive managerial branch are the two main branches. What ought to happen according to normative theory, stakeholders in an organization have the right to be treated fairly. The organization should be administered in the best interest of all stakeholders. Each group ought to be treated as an individual and has the right for information even if it's never used. Issues of stakeholder power aren't immediately applicable, whereas under legitimacy theory, the process of assessing whether or not an organization is genuine is known as legitimation. The social accord represents society's implicit and explicit expectations for how an organization should operate. The organization is allowed to continue operating as long as it meets its objectives. It may be difficult for the organization to obtain the necessary support and resources to continue operations, which might lead to penalties such as legal restrictions, limited resources, or decreasing product demand. To comply with legitimacy definitions are to adjust output goals and operational approaches. Next, under stakeholder theory attempts to explain when corporate management is likely to pay attention to the expectations of specific strong stakeholders. More organization-centered stakeholders recognized by the organization, the amount to which the organization considers the connection has to be managed in the organization's interest stakeholder expectations. So stakeholders' expectations are thought to influence operating and disclosure rules, whereas stakeholder influence are organizations which do not respond equally to all stakeholders, but it is the most powerful stakeholder's power, which is the function of the stakeholder's level of control over the organizational resources. Under legitimacy theory, attempt to alter perceptions rather than behavior and attempting to sway public opinion by diverting attention away from the problem and towards other topics, making an effort to alter external expectations. In conclusion, according to legitimacy theory, a company should always aim to be seen as working within the limits and norms of the society in which it operates. Legitimacy theorists claim that a company would go to any length to legitimize its actions in order to stay in business. The stakeholder theory is concerned with the relationship between an organization and the various stakeholders who make up the organization's society. Stakeholder theory emphasizes that an organization's management must be accountable to its various stakeholders and participate in activities that they deem significant. Because of their many similarities, legitimacy theory and stakeholder theory should not be seen as two distinct theories, but rather as two overlapping viewpoints on the same subject presented within a political economy framework. Stakeholder theory addresses the many stakeholder groups within the society and how they may be best handled, rather than society as a whole, as legitimacy theory does. So that is all from us about stakeholder theory and legitimacy theory. Thank you very much and have a good day.